Ready to start? I would like to thank the Bitcoin Foundation for bringing us all together here. It's my pleasure that I get to speak about the a payment protocol that we called Pay to Contract. This is joint work with Ilja Gerhard from Max Planck Institute at Stuttgart. The idea of the protocol is the payment itself is the contract. Let's see what that means. Well, don't we all know how a payment protocol should work? It should be easy, right? Let's look at a situation like this where you have a merchant and a customer. What would you do? How do they communicate? Well, say the merchant sends an offer to the customer. Customer replies with an order. Merchant produces an invoice. They digitally sign their communication, so they have something in hand afterwards, and the customer pays. That's it. Is there maybe more to it? So to think about that, let's fill these things with some more details. What does the offer actually contain? Maybe the description of an item that is for sale and a price. Then the order refers to a particular offer, contains or specifies quantity and shipping address. Then the invoice contains a copy of the order, the total amount, and specifies a payment address. The customer would then extract total amount and payment address from the invoice, form a payment, and route that payment through some payment system to the merchant, who then takes his goods in exchange and routes those goods through some shipping system. Let's list the assumptions that we are making here about this situation. So, first of all, the general scheme that I just described is a cash in advance scheme with no escrow involved, and I want to assume that both payment system and shipping system are irreversible. I also want to assume that about the identities that the merchant does have a publicly verifiable identity, but the customer does not have such an identity. Furthermore, I want to assume that both parties do not fully trust each other, so they do want to have some signature involved, and that the merchant cares about the reputation that is linked to his identity. Of course, this last assumption is necessary since we have no escrow. Okay. Now, we made an asymmetric assumption about the identities. As a consequence of that, only the merchant can sign and the customer cannot sign anything because he has no identity. Looking at the diagram again, where are the signatures here? We assume the merchant has an identity and he uses that obviously to sign the invoice. But that's not the only signature involved, because we can also think that the payment gets signed by the payment system when it passes through it. Similarly, the goods get signed when they pass through the shipping system, and both these systems produce a receipt of that. So the customer would keep these two signatures for himself, for his records, and the merchant would keep this. Okay, so far this is the standard scheme, standard protocol. It takes care of the lack of mutual trust, but it only works in the absence of attackers. So the main point of my talk is, let's make the assumption that the merchant online infrastructure is vulnerable to an attack. If that is the case, then the merchant will conclude, well, I don't want to sign anything at order time simply because I want to keep my signing key offline and never online. So, sorry customer, I cannot sign your invoice anymore. Note that the key that I'm referring to here is the signing key used for the protocol. Don't confuse it with the private key for any Bitcoin funds. I'm assuming those are in cold storage anyway. So the attacks that we are worried about here are attacks on the protocol level, such as an attacker replacing the payment address by an address of himself. We're not worried here about attacks on the permanently stored funds. Okay, so if the merchant can't sign anything, then we have the problem that we need at least a customer signature. Okay, back to the diagram. Let's analyze the situation. We have the red area, which happens at immediate order time, and we have the green area, which happens outside immediate order time, means before or after. Think of the red area as happening online and is supposed to run unattended, where the green area is running offline or potentially offline. Okay, what can we do? Well, the offer doesn't have to be created at order time, so let's move that over here. Then we can also pre-sign the order, the offer, and have the signing key offline. Okay. Now, what do we do with the payment address? That should be signed, so let's make it part of the offer. What do we do with the shipping address? Or the shipping address here stands for any information that the customer introduces here, so also, for example, the refund address. Well, if we look closely now, the invoice is just a function of the order. So the customer, total amount is a function of price and quantity. So the customer can just compute the invoice by himself, and then the invoice can be sent the other way around. Now, it would be the responsibility of the customer to sign the invoice. Well, we said the customer doesn't have an identity, so, well, let's think again. Does he really have not any identity at all? He has to identify himself at some point to the payment system, right? Whether that is a bank, where he shows up in person, or whether that is Bitcoin, where he signs the transaction. He's implicitly putting his signature under the payment. So if we can somehow get the invoice into the payment record, then we are done. What have we achieved by that? We have this nested structure. There's an interior part which is signed by the merchant, that is the offer, and we have an exterior part which is signed by the customer. So that turns the payment record into a full-blown contract. It's something that is bearing two signatures, one of each party. Hence the title of the slide and the title of the talk. So the two parties keep this contract and the corresponding receipt of the two systems. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's the first result of the talk. That's the basic idea. Now we're getting more technical. We want to see how can we get the invoice into the payment record. So somewhat more generally, we can ask, how can we link arbitrary metadata to a transaction? Let's specify the task at hand more clearly. We have to build a Bitcoin transaction such that a unique hash, the hash of the invoice, of course, is verifiably linked to it. It doesn't necessarily have to be visible in clear text. It has to be linked somehow. There are several methods for that. I will speak only about one method, which is linking the metadata to the output key of a transaction. There may be other ways to get it into the transaction, but I'm talking about a method for the output pub keys. Okay. Convenient notion by an owner of a pub key. I always mean the person who has access to the private key. So let's specify the task again. Now for encoding or linking to an output pub key. The task is, given a pub key P, in the application, this will be a pub key owned and pre-signed by the merchant. Given that, derive a pub key P of M with the same owner. P of M will then be the actual payment address that the customer uses, such that the unique given M, which is the hash of the invoice, is verifiably linked to P of M. Okay, that's the task. To tell you how this can be done, I have to take a little detour and recall some facts about ECDSA key pairs, ECDSA being the signature system that Bitcoin uses. So what's a key pair in that system? There's a large fixed prime N fixed throughout the system, throughout Bitcoin, The private key S in this key pair is simply an integer in the range 0 to n minus 1, and the public key is a function of that private key, of course. Now, these key pairs enjoy a certain property, a homomorphic property. That is, if you have two key pairs, SP and TQ, and say you take the private parts and add them together, this operation is just adding two integers modulo n, and you take the two public parts and add them together, this operation is actually an addition of 2 points on an elliptic curve. But that doesn't have to interest us here. The property that's interesting for us is that what you get is again a valid key pair. Now this may sound very natural, but keep in mind that it's actually a property specific to ECDSA, for example. It's the same thing would not be possible with RSA key pairs. What about the owners here? Well, if T is publicly known, then P and P plus Q have the same owner, simply because from S and T I can compute S plus T, and conversely from S plus T and T I can compute S. This fact is widely used already in deterministic wallets, and what I'm suggesting here is not so much different from a deterministic wallet. So how do we use that for linking metadata to the output pub key? This is the task again that we have, copy from the previous slide. We do the following. We take an HMAC. An HMAC is a function with two properties. One of them is collision resistance, meaning that you cannot effectively compute two inputs that give the same output. And the second property is pseudo-randomness, which means that given one output, you cannot predict new unknown outputs. An HMAC has two inputs, they're called seed and index, and one output. I want to assume here the output is just in the range of our secret keys. So then we feed the metadata into the seed input, we feed an arbitrary pub key into the index, we take the output, which is a secret key, convert it to its corresponding private key, public key, and then we add that pub key together with the arbitrary pub key that we started with to obtain the derived pub key P of m. Now this derivation function gives you the following properties. First, given an input pair P comma m, it is impractical to find another input pair P prime m prime that leads to the same derived pub key. This property is the collision resistance that I mentioned. So we conclude, hence, m is the unique metadata linked to P of m. How is it linked? Well, to prove the link, we just have to know P, then we can verify the link. And why is it unique? Well, there can be at most one m known that is linked in this way to P of m because of the collision resistance. And the second property is that P and P of m have the same owner provided that m is known. This was the key pair homomorphism from before. Now these two properties together already say that our task is fulfilled. However, I want to mention the third property of this derivation function, which is important for some anonymity considerations. Given P, Q and P of m, we gain no information on Q of m. That is, given one output, P of m, we gain no information on another output of that function, even if it's for the same m. And this is the pseudo-randomness of HMAC that guarantees this fact. Okay, so the task of linking metadata is done. We can join the two things and combine them to an example for this payment protocol. Let's say a merchant makes this offer. That's a price list of for three items that he's selling. He's specifying these prices, and he's also specifying a payment pub key, a base pub key in the bottom line. He leaves these fields blank for the customer to fill out, And this resembles an order form. He signs this order form with any signature system that he likes. Doesn't have to be ECDSA. Here's PGP. Okay, so this signed thing is his signed offer that the customer maybe downloads. When the customer has done that, he fills out the blanks with his data. And this is now at the same time his order, and it's at the same time the invoice. So he sends this invoice to the merchant, and then he hashes it, extracts the base pub key from it, takes the base pub key and the hash, feeds those two things into his derivation function, obtains a derived pub key, turns that derived pub key, translates it into a Bitcoin address, and then transfers the total amount, which he computed himself, to that address. By doing this transfer to this address, he has implicitly put his signature under the invoice. Now the merchant can do the same derivation and is looking at the Bitcoin address in the blockchain for an arriving payment. When he has received a payment to this address, he can also be sure that he has received the correct invoice. Because, say, an attacker modifies the invoice while it is transmitted from the customer to the merchant, the result will be that the merchant never finds a payment at the address where he's looking at. So once he finds a payment at the address, he can be sure he has the right invoice and has the right shipping address, etc. Okay, let's summarize the features of this protocol again. First of all, we said we are pre-signing everything. No signing is happening at order time. The customer generates both the invoice and the payment address himself. The customer identity is taken equal to the payer identity, because at the beginning there was no customer identity. We just identify the two. The payment is linked to a unique invoice, or the other way around as well. The invoice is linked to the payment. Payment plus invoice form a contract. Well, in my example here, the payment doesn't really contain the invoice, but just the hash. So we need both of them together to form the contract, actually. And strictly speaking, no SSL communication is required at order time between the two parties, because, as I described in the example, even if an attacker modifies the invoice, then nothing can happen really. I mean, he can, of course, interrupt or disturb the processing of the order, but he can never obtain any funds. And he cannot modify the shipping address either. If such a modification happens, such an attack happens, then as soon as the two parties, merchant and customer, get to communicate somehow over another channel, they can always resolve the matter, and the customer can just resubmit the invoice. So the attacker cannot steal neither funds nor the goods. There's of course a disadvantage to it, because the invoice is crucial to recover the funds that were sent to the derived address. The invoice simply must not get lost, because then the funds are also lost. So in practice, the customer has to back up the invoice before he makes the transaction. Outlook. There's certain more things that you can do with this. I will not go into details, but just mention them. A few additional features. This scheme is compatible, for example, with multisig outputs. This is almost trivial. The merchant just specifies a set of base pub keys, and then the customer applies the derivation function to each of those pub keys with the same m, of course, and then combines those derived pub keys that he obtains into a multisig output. Another example where you have multiple base pub keys would be if you want to distribute your payment, the total amount of your payment, into several transactions. The reason could be that you want to hide the total amount. This can be done just as well. Again, multiple base pub keys are specified, the derivation function is applied to each of them, and then they are just used for separate payments. And finally, anonymity is well protected in all regards that you can think of, or at least it is in all regards that I could think of. And but you have to randomize the invoice actually. So you should the invoice should not be guessable, because then you could also guess the result of the derivation function, right? I mean, the base pub keys are usually thought of as being public. So by introducing a random token into the invoice by either of the two parties, you can guarantee anonymity. And the one property that I mentioned about the property that followed from the pseudo-randomness of the HMAC also guarantees that anonymity is guaranteed for the application in the second line when you distribute your payment across several transactions. So the outputs of those several transactions cannot be linked together. They cannot be identified as belonging to the same invoice. That is what that property guarantees. Okay. I would like to thank you and give some credits to other people on the forum who had similar or identical ideas as we had, and I would also like to give a link to our paper about it. Thank you.
Hi, I just had a technical question. Could you describe again the role of the additional public key going into the HMAC function? Would it not work just to put in the metadata as the seed?
Okay, let me bring up the slide again. Oops. So the question was, what is the arbitrary pub key that is going into this function? The arbitrary pub key, well, the properties are guaranteed for an arbitrary pub key, but in the application it would be the base pub key of the merchant, right? It's the pub key that is pre-signed by the merchant.
Oh, it's the same key. It's the base.
That's the base pub key, right? Another question?
Do you have plans for a software implementation, or?
I actually have implemented for testing something like this, yes. But of course, I mean, it should really be part of a payment protocol. It doesn't really help if you have a single implementation. And I mean, it has to be widely used, and it has to become a standard to be really useful.
Where's the code for that available?
There's something on GitHub. It's called BCPKI. Yeah.
In your example, you had, I think, 8.44 bitcoins going to an address that the merchant would say, okay, now that these bitcoins are here, I know that the customer made an order. How does the merchant get those bitcoins?
How does the merchant get to his bitcoin? He has control of that address.
So he knows what the private key is?
Yes, he derives that from the private key of his base key that belongs to his base key and the hash of the invoice. So if you're looking at this homomorphism again, here it is. So let's say P is his base key and S is the corresponding private key. Then in this example, T would be the hash of the invoice. So he just adds S and T, and P plus Q would be P of M. That would be the derived pub key.
Okay, thanks.
Can the HMAC support any amount of entropy coming in, or are there limits on what that function can deal with?
If HMAC can accommodate any length of data as input, was that the question?
Yes, the broader question is, what limits on entropy does the addition of the HMAC function add? It doesn't limit anything, or it can deal with it? It narrows things a little bit, but it's plenty for a Bitcoin address, so that makes sense.
Requirements about the entropy. Well, we're feeding the metadata, or actually we're feeding a hash of the metadata, and that should have sufficient entropy, right? Okay,
I was just wondering if that function had certain limits to it, but it sounds like it's plenty sufficient. So
yes, thanks. Of course, as I said, the invoice should, for anonymity reasons, always be randomized, right, and not be guessable. Right. Okay, thank you very much.